Good evening, everyone. My name is Sister Marie Viscusi. Welcome to Spirit Alive. If you haven't been here before, I'm the director of the Spirit Alive program, which is a ministry supported by my congregation, the Sisters of St. Joseph. But I'm happy to welcome you tonight to this course, part two of our Buddhism course. And it is being presented, if you were here before, you met him, but if you haven't, by Joshua Schapiro. Joshua earned his Ph.D. In the study of religion with a focus on Buddhism from Harvard University. Very smart man. He's currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Fordham University. His scholarship, research, writing, and teaching is primarily focused on Tibetan Buddhist ideas about teachers and teaching, as well as Tibetan forms of advice writing. That's interesting, advice writing. Schapiro teaches a range of courses and is not limited to Buddhism, a range of courses in Asian religions at Fordham. If you attended his fall course, and I see some of you already did, you know that he is a very engaging teacher who I am delighted to welcome back to the Spirit Alive program. So it's all yours. Thank you, Joshua.
Well, thank you, Sister Maria, so much for having me and to the Spirit of Life Institute and for everyone who chose to be online tonight for bearing with me here. I really had enjoyed the time in the fall, and I'm sure that we'll have some fun in the coming weeks with some really challenging material. Intellectually difficult in a certain way, but also exciting in terms of the kind of moral and soteriological ambition we're going to learn about. So, soteriological ambition, I mean, the kind of ambition for what salvation, both for individuals and also the collective, would look like. But it's going to take us a little bit of time to get there. So, unfortunately, you'll all have to be a little bit patient with me. But in any event, I'm thrilled to be here. So, as with last semester, if you have questions and you don't want to wait or don't want to forget them, please feel free to use the Zoom chat, which can be clunky for some or easy for others. But obviously, at the end of the chat, meaning at the end of our hour of kind of formal presentation, not too formal, but formal style presentation, we can have conversation and people can ask questions if you like. But no need to wait if you want to dump questions into the chat, and I'll either get to them if I see them or we can come back to them. But it's always nice for me to know that you're there. So it's nice that some folks have their video on. Everyone's welcome to if you like. If you choose not to, I understand. Okay, so welcome to our kind of second half of our Introduction to Buddhism class. I'm going to just very briefly share the titles of the first sessions. These are not the sessions that are coming up. These are the ones that you can see were in the fall. I just mentioned that because thankfully Spirit Alive creates these YouTube channels with all of the wonderful videos, not just from this class, but all the fantastic programs they put on. I'm sure everyone knows about this, but on the off chance that you don't, right? It's like one of the real gifts, I think we all can agree, that Spirit Alive produces all of these educational materials. So for our purposes, if you're curious to get more information and some of the background that I'll refer to in our spring sessions, it feels like winter. Usually in academics, we call this spring. In our winter spring sessions, you may want to go back and watch some of these, right? Obviously, there's no quiz, but they're here if you like. So that's why I brought up these titles. We talked about Buddhist ideas of suffering, karma, which has to do with moral action and the consequences of our action, no self, which is a huge topic we're going to get a taste of today and spend plenty of time with in the coming weeks. So basically, criticisms from the Buddhist tradition about our habit of thinking of ourselves as independent. We'll come back to that. And then we talked a bit about different forms of meditation. We'll see a little bit more in the coming weeks. And then finally, renunciation, which is a piece that often gets skipped over in American and European adaptations of Buddhist traditions, because so many non-monks and non-nuns practice Buddhist tradition, especially here. But it was kind of a reminder in the discussion of why renunciation, means giving up your normal family life, work responsibility, and the like, was so central to the path to liberation. And we called this, I don't know if it's up here, the gradual path to spiritual awakening. So that's just a setup as a reminder that these videos are there. What are we doing this semester? Well, we're going to come to some really fun material that I'm going to call the immediate path to spiritual awakening. This is, of course, not my vocabulary, though it might take us 2 or 3 weeks to figure out what we even mean by an immediate path. Sometimes this is called the sudden path. All right. So you can see these are our dates. This first week is going to be a lot of content for which I apologize. As an educator, I don't know how successful an educator, but as an educator, I feel guilty already in advance by how many ideas I'm going to put up on the screen for you today. But I think it'll help us jump into some really rich, fun, stimulating material in classes 2 through 5. And we just kind of need some of these basics. All right. So that's kind of my apology ahead of time, but hopefully we'll have a good time. The ideas that we're about to present are exciting. So it's certainly not boring, but if you feel a little bit overwhelmed with the kind of volume of content, there's nothing wrong with you. It's my choice. And the solution will be, I hope, to come back so we can continue to get into the material. And, or if you're curious, you can go back to some of these course videos from the fall. Fair enough? Okay. So again, welcome to this evening. Let's try to have some fun, I hope. I'm going to do another share. This time we're going to look at some of the content from the first few sessions that we had before, moving relatively quickly, knowing that you can go and watch longer videos and then set up the coming weeks. So you could see from my original documentation, one of the primary problems in any Buddhist path is the problem of suffering. And this is just definitional, right? The historical Buddha, this figure Siddhartha Gautama, who lived, most people agree, around 2,500 years ago. He was born in a kingdom that's now part of Nepal and wandered around India for about 45 years talking to anyone who would talk to him. He addressed explicitly in his sermons to his disciples solutions to the problem of suffering. So this is a map we used very briefly last fall, right? If the Buddha was born in this area and wandered around this kind of central area, central Indian area, you can see that the tradition pretty quickly traveled far. In a few minutes, we're going to get to this transmission up towards China, East Asia, which is usually just our shorthand for China, Korea, Japan, and then some of the teachings that made it back down to Vietnam. So already by around the first century of the Common Era, because of all of the social activity and the merchant activity and the trading activity on the Silk Route, right? Buddhist ideas traveled to East Asia. Which Buddhist ideas traveled and the certain kind of style of the vision of Buddhist ideas that traveled east, that's what we're about to get to. But there were other transmissions that didn't ultimately accept the story we're going to tell for the rest of the semester. And those are traditions primarily in Southeast Asia and especially in the island of Lanka or Sri Lanka. Okay. A lot of these traditions here in Malaysia, Indonesia are relevant to the story, but you no longer have large populations, at least in Indonesia. I mean, there are some Malaysian Buddhists, but most of the Buddhist population is in this area. So in any event, this is just a broad overview. We're going to really be getting into this action here later today. Sound good? Okay, so in any event, this is summary. This is where I go too fast. We said last and past weeks, right, in response to many Buddhist teachings, that one of the way of thinking about the problem of suffering is not simply the suffering that we know is suffering. We're calling this, well, excuse my lack of sophistication, the bad stuff, right? Things that we judge to be bad. And that could be physical pain or mental pain, right? You have a headache, right? Your knee hurts, or you're filled with sadness because you've lost a friend, let's say, right? But also we have this problem of things that we value to be good. And because they change, even the positive experience of them, whether it's like a chocolate chip cookie or a lifelong friendship, has built in the suffering of loss. So for example, if you have a really close friend, obviously if they pass away, there's that suffering. But even the change that you experience while they're alive is a suffering. Not only are there moments maybe in a friendship where you don't connect as well, but as we all know, there are plenty of moments when you're hanging out with people who aren't your close friends, right? And so the very anticipation of the possibility of, let's say, communing with our fellow human being, right, is ruined when we're dealing with difficult people, right? So what's the idea? The idea is that because things are constantly shifting and unstable, there's a certain dissatisfactoriness, instability that appears here in our first category, the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change. And it really is driven home in theories about our own self. Because being human beings with bodies and minds and sensory experience in social contexts, we are always subject to changing conditions. And as dependent beings, if we're independent, we could just protect. But because we're dependent beings, this instability leads to dissatisfactoriness. Okay, so much more on this in the fall. But this is a fundamental problem we're not going to be finished with. And what we said was our responses to this reality of change make things worse. We not only want good things, but we get attached to them and we don't want to lose them, right? We dislike certain things. Sometimes we just try to ignore them or push them away. Obviously, we get angry and then we ignore things. The point is, even in a world of instability, we make things worse habitually. This is really important. We habitually do this. We don't even notice that we're doing it. And beneath this, not noticing that we're doing it is an ignorance about cause and effect, the consequences of our actions, right? As well as ignorance about ourself. So we're going to come back to the self point. But fundamentally, the idea is if we're not aware of the dynamic of cause and effect, by the way, including the cause and effect of our mental habits, right? It's not simply that like we're all nice boys and girls and treat others respectfully in public, but even our mental judgments are doing the job of causing our future suffering. And a lot of this has to do with judgments we make about the self. So again, there's a lot more material on this. If this isn't making sense because we're moving quickly, I acknowledge it. We will come back to this problem of no self many times in the coming weeks. But just as a baseline, which we discussed a lot before, one of the ways that we misunderstand ourselves is assuming we're independent, right? And I always joke in class, but it's even obvious on the Zoom. Nobody is confused, right now on the Zoom, whether I can see you or not, about your independence from everyone else on the Zoom, right? I hope that you're already enthralled with this presentation, right? Probably not quite there yet, right? But there's never a moment of confusion just because you have my voice in your ears through your audio, or if you have headphones like this, or you're so close to your screen that all you're seeing in the world is my face, right? Still, there's no confusion that you are separate and independent from me. That's our instinct. But actually, the more you look, the more you realize this is not true. At least that's the Buddhist argument, right? And this lack of independence causes us anxiety because, in a way, many of our habits during the day, you can think about it from waking up, brushing your teeth, checking email if you all do that, right? Getting dressed in according to your own personal style, trying to talk to the people you love who make you feel like you belong in the world, perhaps engaging in spiritual activities or otherwise, prayer or otherwise. So many of these activities we do in part motivated by a desire to feel like ourselves independently. Yes? By the way, none of this is evil. But from the perspective of much Buddhist philosophy, it's just slightly flawed because there isn't that independent self. So no wonder it's anxiety inducing to live in an unstable world because we're trying to kind of compose ourselves, literally and figuratively, compose ourselves in a world where we can't be composed. And we all know, anyone who's gone through any health crises, which I'm sure is everyone at some moment, that we just don't have anywhere near the control we think we have over our body. But once your body gets sick, that also means you don't have any control of your mind, right? So without depressing everyone, we can just think about, like, let's say you have a bad flu, which can be miserable, but we all know there's worse things. But you have that kind of, feverish like state sometimes where you just don't feel like yourself because with the body goes the mind. So the point here is that there's so clearly not the independence that we think we have, and our efforts to maintain that independence usually backfire. Again, please don't take my word for it, not that you are, but the point here is just simply there are all sorts of Buddhist arguments about this, as well as techniques for investigating. That's what we call meditation. Techniques for investigating our lack of independence, right? So if the self is that which we control, so what we think a self is, that's separate from others and others and separate from the outside world. Part of the process is investigating and realizing there is literally no such thing. There's no part of you that's separate or controllable. By the way, it does not mean you don't have free will. This comes up a lot in classes. This is not a free will issue. There is the possibility of training your awareness so that you can act intentionally. Intentions still exist, but even your intentional actions are bound up with all the things you're responding to. They are in no way independent. Okay, why does this matter? We're going to get to this. Part of why it matters is this very problem of the assumption of self is what leads us to desire. We never desire innocently, we desire for ourselves. That's what it means. You assume there's something that you can get that's going to make you happier. And by the way, this isn't just about some like straw man argument about selfishness or materialism. Right? We want safety for the people we love, right? We want other friends, family, loved ones, even the stranger, right? To be living a life of dignity and satisfaction. Is that clear? So the problem here isn't that we're too materialistic, let's say, about our desires. It's just that we want things that aren't possible in the long run. That's what our desire is, our craving, our thirst, our attachment, our aversion, our anger, our jealousy, our pride. They are all, in a way, theories of the self, things that we think we can get so that we get more control for ourselves or for others. Again, this is important. Our habits of self aren't evil necessarily. I mean, look, some of them have negative consequences, and we'd all agree are a little bit less moral than others. But even, right, some of our sense of motivation to help other beings is tied up with our desire to understand ourselves as morally superior or morally unique or morally special or whatever it might be. And this leads to suffering. Why? Because it's just not possible to succeed at this task. Again, I don't expect anyone to believe me here. Don't take my word for it. But this is part of what the path to liberation that we talked about in the fall months were about from the perspective of Buddhist traditions. Okay, so this is where we're about to transition. In the absence of this attachment to self, which, by the way, is not a New Year's resolution, it's not a philosophical position you can write a paper about, although there's plenty of Buddhist philosophical texts and debate. Is that clear? It's not a bumper sticker. It's not a belief, right? Absent of attachment to self is a habit. It's training. It's training oneself with help from teachers in the community to change your habits of perception of the world. So every time a perception of, oh, that's me doing something, I'm like this is my personality, these are my habits, and otherwise, every time that experience appears to us, which it happens all the time, you recognize it for what it is not quite true. So there are a lot of strategies here in how this is done. But the important point here moving forward is that the process of detachment, which sometimes people respond to in introductory classes, it's not an existentialist commitment to jump into the void of meaninglessness and create your own meaning, even though there's plenty of beautiful philosophy about that. That's not what we mean. We mean actually like from the ground up. And the ground here isn't the ground here is the ground, your habitual mental experience of the world. Like, as in right now, how are you perceiving your relationship to the screen, to the words I'm speaking, to your name that pops up on the screen, right? To my name, and so on and so forth, right? To your feeling of hunger or exhaustion. How do you respond in each moment to that? And part of the way we all respond, myself as well, is with a lot of me, 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 me. Again, I don't mean that insultingly. Like, even if you guys are all selfless human beings, I'm sure at least some of you all out there are, right? We still probably have this habit, right? So in the absence of the habit of attachment to self, this is the argument, all the other stuff falls away because it's got nothing to stick to, right? So I just want to talk about this for just a second because we're going to transition from this vision. And by the way, there's a lot of different Buddhist discussion and disagreement over this point I'm about to make. It's a bit challenging. By challenging, I don't mean challenging for you all, challenging for the tradition, right? But the idea is that something transforms when there's nothing for our desire habits, our anger habits, our aversion habits, our jealousy habits, our pride habits, yes, our identifying with me habits. When they drop, when the me part drops away, none of that sticks. And there's basically an absence of the suffering part. So the question is, what's left if the self habit is absent? And there's a lot of different Buddhist theories about this. Sometimes, for example, in sermons attributed to the Buddha, he says, don't worry about it. right? You're just going to go crazy worrying about it, right? That's not the point. The point is taking the steps to drop the habit. Don't worry about what's on the other end of it, he says. It won't matter then. But of course, Buddhists are human beings, so there's a lot of talk and theory about it. Okay. And we're going to see some of that later in the semester or later in our group of our collection of videos and discussions. Is that clear? So, one basic way of thinking about all the material we covered last time, it's a bit of a simplification, but one basic way of thinking about it is thinking about the gradual path to liberation as a path towards an absence. This doesn't mean a nihilism where nothing is around, but an absence of the habit of self, which means the absence of suffering. And by the way, in a system of karma, which some of you might be familiar with, and if you're not, that's fine. This means an absence of rebirth, which means your continuity of mental consciousness is not going to pop up in another body in the future. Right? So many of you aren't worried about this. Although, by the way, many of us might be worried about heaven or hell. So in a way, we have a certain version of this. Okay. But in any event, their point is when there's the absence of suffering over time, eventually your body dies, and then that's it. There's absence of any continuity in the future. So you've escaped. And this is some of the language. Escape from the cycle of rebirth. Maybe you've heard this phrase, the cycle of samsara is a cycle of rebirth where things are always suffering. Okay, what does it mean that there's an absence? There's all sorts of debate, beautiful imagery, lots of thought and debate about this. Why am I making a big stink about this absence? Because we're going to get a new vision. And that's going to be the next material that we're going to start with. And then we're going to look at for however many sessions we have, 4.5 sessions, right? Here you see a question, right? Is liberation the freedom from suffering? Sometimes people call this awakening. That's what it means to be a Buddha, to wake up. Waking up to a reality free of suffering. Is it just an absence? Now, there's a lot of suggestions in this early material. I'm just mentioning that liberation is an absence. Even the term nirvana, which you've probably heard before, literally means blowing out, like blowing out the candle. Once the candle's blown out, that's it. The fire is gone. That's it. It's gone. It's not a problem anymore. See? Or are there alternative ways of thinking about things? And my basic argument as a college professor is to say there have always been alternative visions beyond simply seeing liberation as an absence of suffering. We're going to look at some famous ones. Fair enough? Okay. All right. So this is now the background material where I throw a lot at you that we need for the rest of the weeks. The strategy for thinking about alternatives to the absence model are going to come from the Mahayana tradition. You see, and we've slightly changed the color. um, the Mahayana, this term up here, literally means the big or great vehicle. Yana, Y-A-N-A, is just a Sanskrit term for a vehicle. Obviously, they didn't have motorized vehicles back then, but they had plenty of chariots. So there are all these famous texts about chariots, right? Maha is the great part. So this is a new vision for the path to liberation that emerges. Scholars are pretty confident by around 100 BCE to around maybe 100 CE. We have textual evidence. Why do we know that there's a new vision? Because in the text, they name it the Mahayana. Is that clear? This is a very self-aware new movement. So historians have argued for years and years and years about what kind of a movement is this? Was it a separate church? Was it an institutional revolt? Was it a revolt of the non-monks? Were there certain communities of people that were organized in certain places in India that put together these new ideas? Was it a intellectual subset of the monastic tradition where everyone lived together, whether or not you believed in this vision, but it was kind of like an alternative model? In any event, there's a lot of disagreements. I don't think that's going to be what's most interesting and fun for us to argue about. But what we do know is that there's a new vision because the vision announces itself as such. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about because I think you're going to find some of these ideas really compelling. Maybe you've heard of some of them before. Some of the kind of ambitions of this new vision, which are really exciting. And these ambitions are going to explain some of the content we're going to introduce in the coming weeks. So one way of thinking about this is Buddhism with presence. Okay, what kind of presents? We're about to get there. Not Christmas presents, presents, as in, you understand. Presents, NCE. Okay, so we're calling this tradition the Mahayana because that's what it tells us it is, the Mahayana. Now, this is a little complicated, but usually these days, especially if you read an introduction to Buddhism text or go online to find an introduction, you're going to see a contrast between the Mahayana tradition and the Theravada tradition. This is kind of and this is a game looking backwards in history. It is clear that around this time there was no such distinction. For one reason, the Theravada was one of many different monastic lineages. The Theravada literally means that which the elders say. A Thera is just an older person, but it's an honorific of an elder. A Vada means speech. Sometimes people translate this as the doctrine of the elders, but that's too strong. Okay, so the Theravada was just one lineage of many, and you see it's a monastic lineage because one of the ways that different communities of Buddhists distinguish themselves is which rules do they follow. And there are hundreds of rules for monks and nuns, right? And there were different schools, literally meaning people who followed slightly different lineages of the tradition. And by the way, you chant and memorize the rules is a big part of these communities. Eventually, the Theravada lineage, it's not that it wins, but it's the kind of monastic lineage that lasts the longest, more or less. But also it becomes a full-blown path to liberation. So a lot of the stories we told last time are related to later formalizations of the Theravada path, which of course in reality are always changing too, right? So that's why it's a little tricky to compare these two. Okay. But why am I introducing even this terminology? Because we still have Buddhist traditions that identify themselves as either Mahayana or Theravada. And we'll look at a map now. Is that clear? All right. The thing that's most important for us right at the moment is to say the Mahayana was a successful alternative vision within Indian Buddhism, but it was gangbusters once Buddhism left India, especially along the Silk Route, especially in East Asia, where you may have noticed there's many, many human beings have lived over the last 2,000 years, especially right now. So that's a big influence. The fact that the Mahayana ideal is the ideal that wins in the Chinese courts in the first couple centuries of the Common Era. And then over the centuries, as Chinese forms of Buddhism develop and therefore transmit them to Korea and Korean forms of Buddhism and Japan, and then Chinese forms of Buddhism that go down to Vietnam. Because this vision succeeds, Mahayana Buddhism has been a really big deal for the last 2,000 years, right? So we say the Mahayana is successful outside of India, and it's really the dominant Buddhist identity in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. And it's really a crucial element to Buddhist identity in the Himalayan regions, as well as Mongolia. So we'll just look at this on the map. We're going to get some ideas from both of these categories, East Asian Mahayana Buddhism, and then the kind of Buddhist identity that's practiced, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. We'll try to at least do 1 week on that. Okay, so needless to say, this vision has been quite popular. Here's an old map I found, right? The yellow are the communities that explicitly identify as Mahayana Buddhist. Is that clear? Right? So East Asia plus Vietnam, basically. Although, by the way, these ideas have mixed everywhere. And then these orange are part of this Himalayan tradition, which we'll get to at the end, sometimes for short called the diamond vehicle. We'll worry about that later. But these orange communities don't reject the yellow communities. It's just that they add on top to it. So in any event, you can see this is a massive deal, big deal in the history of Buddhism, the ideas we're about to introduce. And by the way, these ideas were a big deal in parts of Central Asia, which are no longer Buddhist, down here in Java, the island of Java, right? Part of now Indonesia, they were a big deal. And obviously people knew about this stuff down here in the red area. It's just that over time, certain ideas won out. Okay, so there's a lot of literature about this if you like. I'll do my best to post some of these maps and other materials in the links that Matthew always generates for us kindly in the YouTube videos, in addition to some art if we get that far. Okay, so far so good. We're introducing a new vision. You probably want to know what's the vision. Well, so do I. So let's get there. All right, here we go. Some basics that we need. The first one, and I think folks tend to like this if you're anything like students that take my classes, which is just to say the vision of the Mahayana identifies itself as a great vision or a great vehicle, like think about like a really big bus, right? Because it understands itself as a universal vehicle, the vehicle eventually for everyone. Some of the traditions, by the way, some of the texts that identify themselves as Mahayana, one of which we'll try to talk about later today, but I don't want to promise because I don't want to go too quickly, even claims that this universal vision for everyone, where practitioners work to save all beings, we're going to talk a lot about that in a second, literally is everyone's future. So congratulations. If you're on this video, like all other human beings, you eventually will be a Mahayana Buddhist, according to this vision of the Lotus Sutra we're going to talk about later. And especially because you have a good karmic connection with the tradition, which basically, if you didn't take the class before, that simply means the fact that you're stuck on a Zoom with me on a Thursday night or watching on YouTube is enough to say you've had some interface with these ideas in a past life. Congratulations, which means even more you're guaranteed to be a future Mahayana Buddhist. Not all Mahayana Buddhists have this attitude, but one famous text definitely does. So I always say this in class because I teach at a Catholic school, and I feel like it's fair to say this in Spirit Alive, right? From the perspective of this one text, it's kind of amusing that some of you all might think that you're Catholic because being Catholic is just a short-term step to eventually landing where you all want to go, which is to become a Mahayana Buddhist. So again, before I get fired or kicked off the off the video, take it or leave it. But I'm just introducing these ideas that do come up in for some of these texts, so you understand how universal means. It means everyone is welcomed, even if they don't want to participate. In one of these texts, the guy who took it as his job during the time of the Buddha to create a schism to break off from the Buddhist tradition, and they even tried to get the Buddha killed a couple times unsuccessfully. Even he eventually is going to become a Mahayana Buddhist, as one text tells us. Okay, so let's talk about this universality. Sound good so far? All right, so where were we? Good. So the universality of the tradition is built into vows. When you follow a monastic path, you take a bunch of vows. It's like rules that you follow and commitments you make. So too in the Mahayana, even though some of the popular early Mahayana texts suggested that you don't have to be a monk or a nun, which means you don't have to give up your day job and you don't have to give up your family, right? You can still engage in, material pursuits and so on and so forth. Uh, there's a lot of theories about why Mahayana vision took on so much success in East Asia. And this is one of the theories, is that kind of the elite educated folks in the courts in late Han China, and then moving forward, we're really attracted kind of in salon culture in China, took to this idea of like the lay intellectual, the non-monk or non-nun, and they found this Mahayana path to speak to them. But again, this isn't a history lesson. Just to say that everyone, regardless of whether you're a monk or a nun, takes an additional vow to save all beings. What does this mean? This is an infinite commitment to continually being reborn in whatever place, whether it's in a human body or in an animal body, because animals need saving too, or in a hell realm, showing up voluntarily for lifetimes in hell realms, which are really hot, really cold, and otherwise, right? Or going to divine realms where there's beings who live longer. The idea is everyone's got to be saved. And some versions of the vow are really quite provocative, right? So one famous version of the vow states, beings are infinite. I vow to save them all. What's the idea? You're in it forever, right? The ideal of the Mahayana is that the work is never finished. That's why you do it. So the seriousness of the vow, I don't want to underestimate. By the way, everyone who lives in these countries doesn't take the vow. But to be a practitioner of the tradition on some level, at least in these early versions of the text, is to make this a universal commitment. There is going to be huge consequences for this that we're about to get to. Okay. The name for people who take the vow, the Mahayana vow, to save all beings, which I always joke, but it's true. If you wanted before our next unit, our next meeting next Thursday, to take the Mahayana vow, if you live in the metropolitan New York area, but probably anywhere, you can probably take it. There's a lot of Mahayana Buddhists out there. If you can convince a teacher to give you the vows, you could probably do it, right? And then you could become a Mahayana Buddhist. But it's a very serious vow, meaning the consequences of the verbal commitment and the mental intention are really big. So in another famous text, they talk about how there's a danger from making this moral commitment because if you go back on it, you decide it's not for you, the consequences are extreme. You end up reborn in hell for lifetimes, right? So, please take it seriously. But the ideal is really quite beautiful, which is to say, look, we will do whatever we can do to help liberate beings in small ways or in large ways. It's going to take forever. So, in one sense, there's no rush. And by the way, this is really clear in these Mahayana texts that the scope of the project is enormous. They're always talking about thousands and millions of practitioners in different world systems. There's a very famous text called Vimalakirti, where I'm not kidding, they order takeout food from a different universe where there's a Buddha who is really good at teaching people through smells. It's called something like Ganda Suganda. That's like the teacher who's got great smells. That's how he teaches. And now you're probably wishing, I wish that's what we signed up for, as opposed to the Zoom class. But in any event, the idea is that for the perspective of this conversation, whether this was understood literally or figuratively, is that there are universes. The scale is massive. The project, the Mahayana project, the ambition of saving all beings is literally an intergalactic project. So I think that this kind of the size and the scale, which by the way is beautiful and really fun, and all of the magic tricks that you find in some of these early Mahayana texts are stunning. In the same text, the Buddha, called the Instructions of Vimalakirti, the Buddha shows up. A lot of people come to hear him talk, and he is offered all of these parasols, these umbrellas, as gifts like the local, it's almost like the Boy Scouts show up literally and give him gifts. And the parasol, which is a respectful gift because it was held above nobles, right? They make all these gifts, and the Buddha says, "Oh, thanks. That's great. Now I got all these umbrellas. What am I going to do with all these umbrellas?" And he kind of snaps his finger and creates one massive umbrella that's almost like infinitely large to create a canopy that covers everyone there. Like imagine the last time you were at a huge outdoor wedding, if you were at one of those, but one that's so big, and then everyone looks up at the top of the canopy, and it's as if they went to the Natural History Museum to go to one of those Omni shows. Have you ever been to one of those? Because in the cover of the canopy, they see the entire universe in all of its specificity and enormity. They see the sun, the moon, the stars. They see all the bodies of water down to little streams. All of it appears somehow simultaneously. It's really neat, this text. In any event, why am I going off on these kind of funny storytelling about Mahayana texts? Because the kind of enthusiastic embrace of an infinite ambition to save all beings is um, crucial for understanding all the rest of the material we're going to be talking about. And look, nobody would suggest the tradition of monasticism, following monastic rules, training oneself to recognize your mental habits of attachment to the self, desire, craving, and so on, is unambitious, right? The traditions we've already talked about, including the Theravada lineage, is remarkably ambitious, including all sorts of generous acts of kindness to help other beings. But the Mahayana understands itself as like an explosion. They didn't have this language, but it's almost like an exponential explosion of the ambition. Okay. So I hope this is at least a little exciting. It comes across as very exciting in these texts. All right. So in any event, the beings who take the vow are called bodhisattvas. And maybe you've heard this term before. A bodhisattva literally means a sattva is just a term for a being who strives for a bodhi. Bodhi is the waking up. So if you take certain vows, the Mahayana vows, which are sometimes called the bodhisattva vows, you are technically a bodhisattva. You are on the path to liberating all beings. But that's not the same thing as being good at it, right? So there are examples in the tradition to complement Shakyamuni Buddha, this guy Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. To complement him, there are these bodhisattvas who are beings committed forever that are around magically with all sorts of powers everywhere to help you. Because these are bodhisattvas who've been at it for a long, long, long time. The term bodhisattva you can see here before we get to these examples, which, by the way, if you're sick of looking at me, we're going to look at some images. Uh, Getting there. The term bodhisattva originally was used as a description of the lives that Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, had before he was Buddha. Because, like all of us, there's rebirth. So he was a king a bunch of times. He was a human being. He was a merchant. He was this animal. He was a turtle. He did all sorts of miraculous stuff. So we have lots of these kind of morality tales about the Buddha in past lives. And in his path towards achieving Buddhahood, towards achieving awakening, he was a bodhisattva. So what happens is in this Mahayana deal, they take that model and they say, well, everyone's going to go through that path, right? As long as they commit to saving everyone. And so we all are, in theory, maybe not us because we haven't taken the vow, but in theory, we all have the capacity of becoming bodhisattvas, but there are special ones out there. So there are many, many, many of these bodhisattvas. You can go to a museum. If you're in New York, you're the Met, and go to the Asian wing, which has just stunning Buddhist art from different cultures, and you will see many, many, many bodhisattvas. Two of the most famous are Avalokiteshvara, who is a bodhisattva associated with compassion. I'm going to show you some images of him slash her. And Manjushri, who often has a sword, is a bodhisattva of wisdom. And these folks appear in the Mahayana texts that I've been referencing, but also they appear in Buddhist art everywhere. So far, so good? Okay. So Avalokiteshvara in his different forms is one of the most popular gods or even goddesses, because sometimes he's portrayed as female in Buddhist tradition in Asia, especially East Asia. Why? Because it makes sense to call upon, to make offerings to, or to pray to a being whose literal job is to stick around for eternity to help you overcome suffering compassionately. See how this goes? So sometimes you get images, I'll show you, of Avalokiteshvara with 1,000 arms, which means this is a being who is almost like infinitely capable of helping everyone. And there are stories from these sutras of Avalokiteshvara hearing the cries of all beings, which means any of you, if you want to turn off here to take 5 minutes to pray to Avalokiteshvara, Avalokiteshvara will hear you when you're suffering. So these are really, really popular beings, both in artistic representation and in everyone's everyday prayer. And people always ask, there is plenty of examples of Buddhist prayer, especially in the Mahayana tradition. And these are some of the beings that people pray to. So what do they look like? Well, let me show you. I think that's what's next. Yeah, here are some images of Avalokiteshvara. These three images are all taken from the Met collection. So I'll try to stick the link into the YouTube video we have eventually. And some of you can go see some of these images. You know, there's a big rotating collection here, but these are all in New York City for the New York fans. In any event, this is Avalokiteshvara from Thailand, which is, by the way, a country that no longer really has active Mahayana tradition at all. But you can see this beautiful statue, right? Because the idea is made it there of this bodhisattva committed to hear all beings. These different heads represent different stages of the path to becoming good at waking up. There are a lot of skills we're going to have to develop here, but also all of the arms that are here to help. Make sense? So, congratulations. We've now met Avalokiteshvara, who, by the way, has always been around listening to your prayers. That would be the story. Here we have a beautiful Guanyin, which is a Chinese version of Avalokiteshvara. So if anyone is of Chinese heritage, ancestry, or is Chinese friends, I almost guarantee they will have heard of Guanyin, who's probably the most popular goddess in China. There's a couple candidates, but is a very important god and goddess in East Asia and recipient of prayers. And very often, this one's a little bit hard to tell, but very often Guanyin is explicitly seen as female. Same thing. This is a bodhisattva image and a beautiful one. And here we have a Tibetan one. Chanrezi is just Avalokiteshvara in Tibetan. We'll get to the Tibetan tradition at the very end of our videos. And here you can see the 1,000 arms. See how this goes? All right, so bodhisattvas. Any quick questions here? Before we have a little bit more content before we get to our 8 o'clock open discussion. But if you have any concerns, you can drop them in the chat. Sister Maria, please.
Yeah, just two things. When you say that they work to save all, I mean, what is the work?
Yeah.
What is the work? I mean, every time I talk to you, I'm always thinking like a Catholic. So I'm trying to think is what is the work and then what are you being saved from? Is it
Yeah,
always the self?
yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So in a way, that's a great transition. So there's no singular answer for what the work is, but there's a good reason that there isn't a single answer we're about to get to. But yeah, the ambition is always waking people up, meaning waking people up from attachment to self, waking people up from suffering. Okay. But part of the path is developing the skills to wake people up,
Right.
which, believe it or not, Maria, isn't going to be an answer to your question. So again, the vision, the kind of exponentially ambitious vision has all sorts of facets. But one theme that's everywhere in the Mahayana tradition, in the text, in the practice, is developing skillfulness. And in fact, if you look at the 10 stages, which incorporate all sorts of different practices, some of the skills you get towards the higher stages as an advanced bodhisattva, like Avalokiteshvara or Manjushri, is skill at teaching. Because ultimately, that's what bodhisattvas are. They're teaching. But there isn't a set curriculum anymore. It doesn't mean there isn't a lot of Buddhist texts and concerns about what the path should look like. And by the way, debates about it that we're going to touch on. But there's a recognition that you only can teach people, and you see this on the slide now, where they are. That's our language, meeting people where they are, right? That's not a quotation, right? But people say this all the time. But the language from the Mahayana tradition is explicitly that you address their needs. So there's a famous rendition of this skillfulness. It's called upaya, the skillfulness that allows people to wake up to reality, basically. That's attributed to the historical Buddha. And they said back when he was alive, he had this remarkable skill, which is that he could teach to a massive audience, as he did often. Let's say he taught to an audience of 1,000 people, right? Or even more ambitiously, let's say he taught to 36 people on Zoom late on a Thursday night, right? And he had this skill where he only had to speak once, but everyone on the Zoom, everyone in his audience heard exactly what they had to hear.
Wow.
Now, this is a challenge. The assumption here in this rendition is that actually for most people, it doesn't work that way, which is to say, right, if I want to speak directly to Carol, I would need to know enough about Carol or pick up on enough cues to speak to Carol. If I want to speak to Matthew, I need to understand where Matthew's coming from. Fran, Maria, right? Eileen, these are just some of the names I see, right? And by the way, as human beings, you all know how this works, right? You can't, based on your role in someone's life, your personality, their interests, you can't give the same pitch. But in these Buddhist Mahayana texts, they talk about bodhisattvas going everywhere, right? By everywhere, I mean everywhere, right? They go to Atlantic City. I always joke, but it's true. In that text, they talk about going to like the equivalent of casinos. They go to brothels. They go to the marketplace. They hang out with the business folks. They get involved in politics, everything. Why? Because everyone's got to be saved, right? And you can't have the same pitch on Wall Street, like down there where I live, that you can't have out in Staten Island, or that you can't have the same one in Iowa that you can have in Kathmandu. It's not going to work, right? Not to mention, by the way, and there's a lot of explicit discussion about this, linguistic difference. So one of the skills you need if you're going to be a bodhisattva is you got to get really good at languages. And you have to understand not only the details of Buddhist teachings, but how to transmit them in different literal languages, but also figuratively. Also means, by the way, you have to have a beautiful voice. They talk about this, right? So I'm going to fail this test. But you want eventually to be sufficiently eloquent, right? And mellifluous, which is one of the attributes, by the way, of some of these bodhisattvas, that people are naturally attracted to hearing you talk. You see? So in any event, this is why it's hard to answer your question, Maria. There's a lot of argument, especially in Indian texts, about the different stages. So it's not as if anything goes, right? There are a lot of rules actually in early Buddhist Mahayana texts. And there's a certain openness to skillfulness. And you guys are going to like this. I'm going to tell a story about this in a minute. But there's even the embrace of skillful lying, meaning if one is able to recognize people's needs, then you can lure them onto the path, even if you're not giving them the whole pitch. which, by the way, is an explanatory idea that explains why there's so many different Buddhist teachings. Of course, the Buddha didn't say the same thing every day because he was talking to different people. They had different stuff to hear, which please prepare to be offended. The Buddha didn't say this. I'm just using it as an example, right? But that's why so many of you might on this video might be Catholic, right? Because you're not really ready for the real deal yet. Sorry. You can't quite handle the infinite ambition of the Mahayana. The Lotus Sutra says stuff like this, right? But you can handle salvation through, you know, good works and following the model of Jesus Christ or something. You see? So even sometimes the Mahayana tradition, especially the Lotus Sutra, explicitly will look at other traditions, not so much Christianity because the dates don't line up here, but nowadays could, as themselves skillful means, you see? So what's true in this tradition? It's not that things aren't false on some level, like attachment to the self is false. But on some level, even if you teach people in a way that makes them feel more comfortable about themselves, it could be skillful because you got to get them where they're going. So, for example, in this one text here, I'm going to talk about just for a minute. So we have some examples. You have parables. The Lotus Sutra was this triumphalist, universalist text I was talking about earlier, which is one of the Mahayana texts that calls itself a Mahayana text. See? And this is the text where you have all of these prophetic claims that everybody eventually is going to become a follower of the Mahayana, if you remember that from a little bit earlier. And in the text, it doesn't just declare everyone's going to be Buddhist, but in between those kind of projections of the future, these prophetic claims, these prophecies, really, you get parables. Why? Because parables are skillful. We like stories, right? And all the stories are about skillfulness. So, for example, there's a story about basically like a outward bound leader, right? Who takes a group of people out on a hike, right? And you know what happens? A couple of days into the hike, or I don't know, a couple hours into the hike, people get grumpy, right? Because like the all the nuts and the chocolate chips run out of the nut mix, and you don't have enough water, and the weather. You guys know that you know the drill, right? And so this guide says, "Okay, guess what? Right over this next hill, that's the city that we've been hiking towards. That's where we've been going the whole time." And this parable is called the Phantom City because it's not a city at all. He just, through his magical capacities, created the illusion of a city so everyone could go, put down, take off their backpacks, get some fresh water, take a shower. I don't know if they had that back then, but you get the idea. Bathe however they bathe, get a snack, or go to Starbucks. And then um, once they were relaxed, the guy came back and said, "Hey, by the way, I was lying to you. This is just a phantom city." Poof, right? It was magic. But because of the skillfulness of the phantom city, this teacher is able to motivate people to keep on going. And where do they eventually go? They go to the full awakening so that they can help other beings get liberated. That's the ultimate goal of the city. So the phantom city is a lie, but it's a skillful lie, do you see? And so this is usually rendered in the Lotus Sutra not as a criticism of other religions necessarily, although we see that later, but it's a interpretation of early Buddhist texts. So, for example, this Lotus Sutra might say something like, well, all those Zoom sessions from the fall about monasticism and the certain forms of meditation were like a phantom city. They weren't the full story. They weren't outright lies, but they were manipulations, right? And so part of what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the semester are, or the rest of our sessions together, are really compelling ideas that come out of this Mahayana vision in the spirit of skillfulness, recognizing people's needs, right? So one kind of very famous story that I think is helpful to tell here for us before we close and we'll take questions is the burning house parable. By the way, you can look this up. It's one of the most famous stories in history of East Asia. And the story goes like this. There's a wealthy house owner who has like a big mansion, beautiful house, and there's a lot of staff in there. Sometimes you get a whittled down version of the story, but a lot of people living in a house. And most importantly for the story, he's got three sons, right? One day he leaves the house and he looks back and he says, "Uh-oh, small problem. My house is on fire." By the way, right, to kind of ruin the ending of the story here, Our house is the house that's on fire. So the burning house is a common way of referring to the world we live in, not just because of climate change and political trauma and war, but because of the impermanence of things. Things are always burning. That's the suffering, literal pain that we experience. I hope not too much tonight, but we all have it sometime, right? But also the instability, right? What's the problem with your house if you're on the fifth floor of the mansion and the stairwell's on fire? That stairwell is going to collapse. You're stuck. You see? Okay, so he runs back into the house. There are different renditions. There are two renditions in the Lotus Sutra itself. He runs back into the house and he tells his kids, I don't know what he tells the kitchen staff and everyone else, but he tells his kids, his three sons, he says, guys, bad news. House is on fire. Let's get out of here. Right? And they say, blow off, Dad, because they're busy with their games. So you can imagine, like nowadays, like they're on video games, or they're on their phones, or they're playing, I don't know, they're playing chess or something. You see, right? Which is a mention of all of us. Like we all know that the world is on fire on some level. But, I have a mortgage, but I have grandkids to visit, or I have my own kids to visit, or I have a degree to pursue, or I have this hope and dream. I really want to finish this book project I'm writing, right? I mean, this is how we all live, every one of us, which, by the way, from this perspective, to insult everyone on the group, including myself, are manifestations of our attachment to self. Doesn't mean we're selfish, but we're attached, you see, to our projects, you see? Which, if you think about it, if we really treat the world as on fire, who cares about our projects, right? Be like, Matthew, stop working on the YouTube here, doing the tech here, right? For with all due respect, like, who cares about our video here, right? Let's go out and, I don't know, feed people or something. Okay, so in any event, before you all leave, please don't yet, right? He has to lure the kids out of the house because even though they say, all right, maybe I smell a little bit of smoke, Dad, you're overreacting. It's not so bad. Stop being such a pessimist, right? He's got to trick them to get out because they're not going to leave. So he makes promises, he bribes them. And this is what the skillful means are. He promised them, in this case, three different carts. I always get this wrong, so I apologize, even though I know I'm supposed to be the professor. One of them's a deer cart, one of them's a goat cart, and one of them's an ox cart, I think. Why do they get different promised carts? Because they all have different interests, right? Like some of us like country music, some of us like, sonatas, some of us like rock and roll, some of us like jazz, some of us like hip hop, whatever it might be, right? We all have our different preferences, right? If I tried to lure you out of your house with tickets to Madison Square Garden or something to see a pop show, some of you would say, great. Some of you say, there's no way in a million years there's anywhere I'd rather be, right? Than Madison Square Garden for a pop show. So it's the same idea. He's got to lure people out with a lie in a way. And it works. He lures them out. This is skillfulness, skillful means. And then, by the way, what do they all get when they get out? They get a souped up ox cart, which is the Lotus Sutra's version of itself. It's saying, eventually, remember the promise? Everyone is going to become a Mahayana Buddhist and be part of this great vehicle. That's why he's offering them carts, because they're vehicles. Everyone's going to be a part of this great vehicle and have the ambition ultimately to go back into the house and get everyone else out, you see? But the idea here, why I'm introducing the Lotus Sutra, is this focus on one, the ambition of liberating everybody, doing whatever it takes to liberate them, even skillfully lying. Why? Because we all have our different needs. We come from different places. We come from different backgrounds. We have different attachments. And it's just not going to work to be preaching at everyone, right? Like, Bible thumping or something to the wrong audience, people aren't going to listen. Some people it's going to be great. Some people are going to tune you out, you see? And so this is part of the self-understanding of what the Mahayana is. And we're going to explore this in the coming weeks, different facets of this. So my last slide before I open it up, I hope, is just some coming attractions, right? These words probably don't mean anything to you, but what we're going to start talking about is how, in the spirit of skillfulness, should you teach what no self is? This idea we talked about briefly earlier, which is really scary. Nobody wants to hear that they don't have an independent self, myself included. So you get really interesting innovations in how to do so. The first one is going to be this idea of Buddha nature. That's what we do next week. And then the second one, which scares everybody once we get there, is the idea of emptiness, which is an expansion of what no self really means. And then we get to just some like mind-altering ideas, true, false, or otherwise. They are really ambitious. So I hope this is enough of an advertisement for the next couple weeks to keep you curious. I assure you My delivery may be lacking, but the content is really, really, really exciting. And we'll do our best to make it fun. Okay, so thank you guys for sticking out here on for an hour on a Thursday evening or on YouTube whenever you're watching. And I'm thrilled if anyone has questions, you can stick them in the chat or just raise hands, or just start talking. I would love to talk for another, 10, 15 minutes if you'd like to, please.
Matthew, do you want to unmute people so they don't have to bother with that? Can you do that?
Yes, I can ask people to unmute.
Thanks.
So I know it's a lot of ideas and it's a little scary, especially online, to be the one to jump in. But please, if there are any questions, big or small, that you'd like me to address, or at least start to address, I'm thrilled to do so. Does any of this material, I'm curious, Sister Maria, if you have a question, please ignore what I'm asking. But for everyone else, is there any of this material that actually sounds familiar, whether it's religious presentations you've heard before or Buddhist presentations? I'd be curious to hear. But before, Sister Maria, did you have a question you were going to ask?
No, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, of course it sounds familiar, and there are things that resonate with ideas in Catholicism that we're here to save the world, although we're not the ones who do what Jesus does, that we
Mhm.
participate in that. That's why I asked you the question about work, like what is it that we do? I guess the place that, I remember this from the last course and even tonight, is the notion uh of this self as what we need um to separate ourselves. Is that a proper terminology? Would that be correct?
Sure.
See, I cannot wrap my head around it. Is that like the hardest thing for a non-Buddhist who's taking course in Buddhism for the first time to understand?
I would say it's the hardest thing for Buddhists to understand,
Oh, interesting.
meaning it's the secret that unlocks the whole path. So
Mhm.
the tradition sets up the challenge of recognizing no self as, in a sense, the hardest thing. Not hard because it has to be complicated, actually. Some of the arguments are very logical, but because of the habits that we have. Yeah. And one thing I just want to add looking forward here that I think probably everyone can understand even without any background in the Buddhist tradition is how often our self-consciousness or attachment to our own self-image or public image interferes with helping other people. I don't mean to say like we want to be bad people, but think about embarrassment, anxiety. Is this appropriate? How am I going to understand? Am I going to negatively influence myself or my family or otherwise? So the very idea of self from the Mahayana tradition interferes with our capacity to be selflessly of help to others. So I say this to students all the time, and I'm sure you guys have experience. Like sometimes the students who volunteer I always joke, like go build houses with Jimmy Carter or something, right? On spring break or volunteer at the soup kitchen or something. Or sometimes, not always, but sometimes like almost the most insufferably self-attached, right? I mean, not always. I don't think we really should I'm in no place to complain about people doing service, right? But you can imagine how sometimes you have the problem of people saying, hey, I'm so special. I'm doing this practice. I need to look down on the people of need, right? I'm sure you guys work with this all the time, right? And kind of condescendingly offer their services to others. Or you can imagine like, big fancy fundraising philanthropy gatherings, right? Where everyone is thinking they're saving the world, right? Again, it's hard to know from the outside how everyone's experiencing it. But the point is, it's very possible for even when you think that you're generating a good intention to help others, you're really attached to your own self-vision, right? And I think we all understand this. This is like a spiritual challenge, to be fair, for I assume all human beings. So that's part of the reason for Mahayana why it's such a big deal to explore self. Because once one drops all of the different visions of yourself as being permanent, stuck, fixed, that you have to have a consistent personality, identity. If you just drop that stuff, you can do anything to be helpful, which, by the way, is almost impossible for us to imagine. we'll see some fun examples as this session goes on, or these sessions go on.
So, Jonathan, Joshua, excuse me, so is self, I mean, does that translate into, is that the same thing as ego?
Well, that's a really common uh,
Misconception.
well, no, it's a common translation. It's a common terminological application, right? And I think it really
Okay.
just has to do with what kind of connotations do you have for ego, right?
Hmm.
But I would say it's more like granular than the way we most of us think as ego, right? If you're being kind of Freudian about it, and the ego is that what kind of function of the personality that unifies the other pieces, that
Right.
unifies like both our drives and our kind of like self-regulatory social mechanisms, then sure, you could think about the self as that which we assume makes a continuity of our experience. But the self really, as the way I teach it in classes, is more like a habit. Like literally, you're all building the self habit, as am I right now, by looking at your image or not your image. You're either looking at your image on the Zoom or you're looking at your name. And in so doing, you are very subtly identifying with the image, the picture of the person. Even you say, well, like, I look great in this light, or this isn't representing whatever they look like, or the real me is what I look like when I was 20, or whatever it is. Or like, yeah, that's my name, but my name is cut off, or I use a nickname. You see what I mean? But we all have some kind of subtle relationship, don't we? I mean, you can tell me otherwise, with our little box right here. And that is a habit. You see what I'm suggesting, Sister Maria? So it's like every moment we rebuild it. At every moment you're having an experience, in this case, a visual experience or an auditory experience, and you think you're the one hearing or seeing things, you are separating yourself from the things you're hearing or seeing. That's a self habit. We'll
Hmm.
try to get into this a little bit more, but that's why I say I don't think ego is a bad translation. A lot of people use it, but it's much more granular. It's a moment to moment habit. I don't know if that's helpful. But you
Hmm.
can see again in the context to keep on coming back to the Mahayana ideal, well, that habit would interfere, right? So like for example, I'm by the way not a bodhisattva. I don't have any Mahayana vows or anything. I don't want to misrepresent myself. But you can just imagine, even as the professor, I have PhD up here. Thank you for putting that there, team, right? On my Zoom, right? I have to identify in some way as looking like a college professor. I don't want to mispronounce things. Every couple sentences, I should probably throw in a long word. And you can see how like this just gets in the way, right? Like maybe if I sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, that would be a better way to teach something here, but I'm too embarrassed to do it. You see? So I'm not even skillful enough to imagine how that would help. But you can play along, right? You could see how that would work. So that would be an example of how my self habit, needing to maintain a self identity, a performative identity for you
Got it.
all, but also for me, would keep me from being as skillful as I possibly could be. So that's going to be one of the themes moving forward.
Thank you. That's informative. I think Carol has her hand up, Joshua.
Please.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that I've experienced a Vipassani 10-day
Mhm.
meditation, and it was probably one of the most profound experiences of my life. But the reason that I attended it is because I really wanted to understand and be more proficient and be able to share um, the importance and depth of contemplative centering prayer and presence. And I am so grateful to be here because now I'm getting some of the background of why I did what I did. I will go back someday, but it certainly was such a profound experience. Thank you so much, Joshua.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Carol. That's really inspiring. That's great. Those 10-day sessions are no joke, right?
No, actually, I'll also share that the first 3.5 days were also probably the most painful days of my life,
Mhm.
in trying to get the posture, get the whatever, be whatever I needed to be, get my breathing right, whatever. I don't remember the other days, but I remember coming out the other end and the person I was at that time.
Oh, thank you so much, Carol. That's exciting.
Beautiful. Wow.
Anyone else while we're here? So I'll just say then to close that next week, we're going to introduce, I believe, this concept of Buddha nature, which has been criticized by some members of the Mahayana community as a way of sneaking the self back into the practice. And then it's argued by others to say this is actually the ultimate vision of what does remain once one gives up attachment to the self. So you remember I tried to introduce this idea of absence.
Right.
So the Buddha nature is one solution for what is present when the attachment falls apart. Some people said, oh, that's too much self-talk. Whereas you can imagine nowadays it'd be like, oh, that's too much ego talk or too much soul talk, right? But others will say, no, no, this is ultimately one of the most important intentions of the Buddha, to teach that there is some kind of skillful presence that is there, that maybe, I don't know, Carol, you get a taste of or something when you do a 10-day retreat. I don't know, right? And that's usually really fun material. Also, it's a little bit, not the right word is, sure what the word is, but it's almost a little satisfying that on the other end there is something kind of valuable remaining. But we'll have to argue about it a little bit. So I hope that we'll have a good time with Buddha nature. And if you've been even marginally scared off by this original presentation, I think you might end up a little bit happier next week. But that might be famous last words.
Mhm. Yep. So as we bring tonight to conclusion, I mean, I think one thing that's impressed all of us from every religious tradition is the walk of the Buddhist monks across the United States. Uh, right? I mean, they have, you know, they have showed us a way of peace and without doing a whole lot more except walking with their dogs. So, so with that in mind, uh, if we can walk peacefully tonight from this evening of insight and understanding, that would be a great thing. So thanks so much, Joshua. Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you. Good
See
night,
you
everyone.
next. See you
Thank you.
next week.